Welcome to the Stories Behind the Songs with Dave Kittle. Back in 1979, Dave began a radio career at CHEZ 106 in Ottawa, which spanned 17 years. He was one of the on-air voices that I grew up listening to, and he introduced me to new music that literally changed my life. His knowledge and passion for music are inspiring, to say the least. And in this 6-part podcast, Dave and I sit down and discuss the British invasion.
They did not get into the rock and roll bug, even though they were approximately the same age as the Beatles were.
Right.
I remember it like it was yesterday. I remember a friend of my brother's, halfway after their appearance, they performed twice on the show, at the very beginning and the very end of the show. Went out on our back porch and found an old mop. I'm not kidding. This is true. Came in with this mop on his head and an old wooden ping pong paddle that we had on our. Why I remember this, I don't know, but I do. I remember it was yesterday. And came into the living room after they had performed, playing this thing, much to the hilarity of everybody in the room except me.
Okay.
You
didn't find that funny?
Not particularly, no, because this was to everybody else in the room except me. This was, the old standard. Oh, who are they? They didn't get it.
Okay.
But I did.
Yeah.
And everybody else of the same age right across North America got it, because that moment probably was the most influential moment in the history of rock and roll, I would say. It influenced more people to grow their hair long, take up a musical instrument, and pursue music as a career probably than any other event in...
That's amazing.
I would say in the history of rock and roll was that night. In February '64.
When you saw them, when you were watching them on the Ed Sullivan Show, and I'm assuming it was in black and white.
Oh, of course, yes.
Okay. And for those of you listening that are millennials or whatever, there was a time when actual TV was not color. Believe it or not, ask your parents. Anyway, so when you saw them, what was going through your head? Like, you're watching them perform. You've never seen anything like these guys.
Nothing.
They were kind of clean cut, odd looking, standing up straight, moving ever so slightly when they were playing, I guess. Like, they were...
The thing that struck me the most was how much fun they were having.
Okay.
I mean, these guys were digging what they were doing. They were different. They had long hair for the time, but, compared to later on, it was nothing.
Exactly.
But they all dressed it. They looked sharp in the suits.
In the suits, yeah.
The suits. The fact that they had a left-handed musician in the band that framed the band. They had a left-handed player on one side and a right-handed player on the other side.
Yeah, it actually framed, yeah.
The fact that they had two microphones. This is an interesting thing about the Beatles. For their entire live career, they performed with two microphones on stage. They could have had three quite easily, but they never used three microphones, even though they had three very good singers.
Yeah.
They always used two mics. And the backing singers, which almost... 99% of Beatles songs had a lead singer and backing vocals.
Right.
The lead singer would be on one mic, and the two backing singers would be on the other mic.
Yeah.
And that's a very interesting thing.
That's right, because the other two, that's right, George Harrison
they always,
and John would
or if Paul was singing live, George and John would be on the other mic.
Right.
Or if George was singing live, John and Paul would be on the
Now,
other
Ringo
mic.
had a mic, right? He had a mic up at his drum set.
He did, but he didn't sing. He didn't sing. The only time he sang was when he sang lead on a song.
Oh, okay.
So he did every album they had a Ringo song.
Yeah.
On every album the Beatles ever made, they had at least one song that Ringo sang lead on.
Yeah.
And when they performed live, he did a couple of songs. He did like Honey Don't and I Want to Be Your Man and a couple of other tunes. But other than the times that he sang lead, he did not sing.
Wow. Yeah.
So they had the three front men, and they always used two microphones, which I always thought was very cool.
Yeah.
The two of them standing there, Everly Brothers style.
Right.
The Everly Brothers were a massive influence on the Beatles. Massive influence. Just like the Everly Brothers always shared one microphone. They never used two mics. They always shared one microphone.
What does that suggest to you? Like, when you see that, is that kind of like a... I'm going to use the word, although I don't mean it in any weird way, but there was a sort of an intimacy. Like, you could tell they were very close.
They were very close.
Right?
They were very close. Yeah. I think it had a lot to do with the fact that their harmonies were so, what's the word I'm looking for? So intricate.
Okay, yeah.
One of the things about the Beatles that always amazed me right through their entire career was their use of backing vocals. You listen to a lot of songs like You're Gonna Lose That Girl, Help, a couple that come to mind. Listen to the backing vocals, Paperback Writer.
Oh, yeah.
Listen to the backing vocals. They're so well arranged and so different than what anyone else is doing. But they were so intricate that I think that the two backing singers using one microphone were, because don't forget, back in the day, they had no stage monitors.
Correct. No earpieces.
No earpieces.
Nothing, yeah.
They basically had their amplifiers on stage and their PA, and that was it. And of course, they couldn't hear anything because there was so much screaming going on.
Yeah.
That them trying to do these backing vocals, the two of them singing into the same microphone, they could kind of hear the other person,
right,
and try to harmonize together.
Yeah.
But it just looked cool. I've never ever seen another band that did that.
Yeah.
And they did that through their entire career, right up until '66 when they stopped performing live. They always had two microphones on stage, and the two backing singers would sing into one, and the lead singer would sing into the other. And I always thought that was very cool.
That's very
but
cool.
That you're asking me about what I thought the first time I saw them was just how much fun they were having and how catchy the songs were. My God, they were so good, and they were playing it all themselves. You know, but I didn't know back then that they wrote it. I had no idea that they wrote this stuff.
Okay.
Until, you found out, you looked at I remember looking at the first album I ever got was Beatlemania with the Beatles, the black and white Robert Freeman cover with their faces in the shadow.
Okay.
The four of them.
Oh, yeah.
The black and white cover, the Robert Freeman photo. Which was the first album released in Canada, Beatlemania with the Beatles.
With the Beatles, okay. Yeah.
It was their second album. Please Please Me was their first album, but it was released in the UK only. Beatlemania was the first album released in North America and Canada, but a little bit different in the States. It was called Meet the Beatles, with a little bit different song selection.
Right.
But it came out in Canada as Beatlemania with the Beatles, with the same song selection as the British version. Looking at the writers' credits, and there was writers like Barry, Robinson. I had no idea who these people were. Chuck Berry, Smokey Rob. They did You Really Got a Hold on Me. There you go.
Yeah.
Which was a Smokey Robinson and the Miracle tune, covered by the Beatles, and the writer was Robinson. I had no idea who that was. I had no idea who Barry was.
Okay.
I had no idea who Gordy was. But there was, Lennon McCartney. So you looked at it, hey, they write their own stuff. I didn't know that. Nobody knew that. Only shortly afterwards did you realize that they wrote their own stuff, which was even more unique. But now, I didn't know this at the time. I learned this later. But prior to the Beatles, the way it worked was songwriter wrote a song plugger plugged the song to a publisher, and the publisher found an artist to sing the song. Okay. And that's the way it worked. The performers never wrote their own stuff. Buddy Holly did. Little Richard did. James Brown did. Yeah. Chuck Berry did. But they were the exceptions to the rule back then. Yeah. The Everly Brothers did later on, but the Everly Brothers, all their big hits, Wake Up Little Susie, All I Have to Do Is Dream, these guys were written by Bordeaux and Felice Bryant, a songwriting team from Nashville, Tennessee, who wrote all those early Everly Brothers songs. They started writing their own material a little bit later on in their career, but back then they were given songs by songwriters and song pluggers and publishers to record. Yeah. And then the Beatles hit, and hey, these guys write their own stuff, and they perform it. They were a self-contained unit. They were quite a unique. But when I first heard them, I didn't know that. Nobody knew that at the time. They just were four really cool-looking guys who shook their heads and played catchy stuff and looked cool and were having a good time.
Yeah. And you could certainly see that whenever they did an interview with anyone, right? They just had so much fun.
That was one of the big appeals of the Beatles when they first appeared, was their personalities.
Yeah. Well, they were sassy.
They were sassy
and people loved it.
And they had a great sense of humor, and they didn't give a shit.
No.
and they it was a big joke to them. It was fun. As a matter of fact, George Martin, the producer, was quoted many times saying that when he signed the Beatles, it wasn't really because of their musical ability, it was because of their personalities. That was the thing that attracted him to them, was the fact that they were so funny and got along so well,
but
and
boy,
were
did he strike gold
very tight.
Yeah, and he struck gold with the musical ability, didn't he?
He certainly did, because they were pretty crude back when George Martin signed them to Parlophone Records in late '62. I'm guessing here. I'm thinking, late '62 was when they first made their first stuff. They had already failed an audition with Decca Records, probably the biggest record company in the UK. They had failed an audition. The famous line by the head of Decca, Dick Rowe, was telling Brian Epstein, their manager at the time, "I'm sorry, Mr. Epstein, but guitar groups are on their way out." That was his famous line to Brian Epstein. Yeah, and that's why he turned the Beatles down.
You've been listening to The Stories Behind the Songs with Dave Kittle. Join us again next week for the continuation of this podcast, brought to you by Sunholes Music. Download the latest album now at sunholes.com.